Hello and welcome to the Deep Roots podcast. I'm Matt Bingham. I teach here at Oak Hill College. I'm joined here with my co-host Tim Ward, who also teaches here, and together we are joined by our faculty colleague, Dr. Sydney Tooth. Sydney, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's great to be here.
Now, Sydney, you're choosing the topic that we're going to get into. Tell us what the topic is.
Yes. So hopefully we're going to be talking about eschatology, which we'll get into what that means, in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians.
Okay. Now, why that topic?
Well, Tim, that is what I did my PhD research on, and I have not had much chance to talk about it during my time at Oak Hill, so I thought,
here we go.
Time to myself.
We're on.
Better do it now.
And everybody who's ever done a PhD is utterly convinced the topic they did is the most important topic in the whole world. That's what happens, isn't it?
That's exactly how it works. And where'd you do your PhD, Sydney?
I did my PhD up in Edinburgh at the University of Edinburgh.
Can I say that's the very best place in the world to do a PhD?
All
the best people have done theirs there.
Absolutely.
Great. Now, just tell us a bit about yourself, because you've been here at Oak Hill a year?
A year, yeah. Yeah, I've been at Oak Hill a year. I am not originally British, if you can't tell from my accent. So I grew up in Texas in the US, studied part of my undergrad degree there, came on a study abroad to St. Andrews in Scotland. And if you've ever been to St. Andrews, it sort of captures your heart and never lets you go. So I stayed in Scotland.
And freezes you to the spot.
Freezes you, yeah. So various ways it keeps you there. Did my undergrad in St. Andrews and then did a year with UCCF doing their relay program. Met my Scottish husband and went on to do my master's and PhD and have just stayed forever.
Fantastic. We're very glad you have. And drag your Scottish husband down here to the deep south.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Dragged him down.
We're glad he's come. First off, if anybody's just scrambling for the dictionary, eschatology.
Yes, eschatology has to do with end times things. So it's from the Greek eschatos, which just means the end. So what does end times things mean? Things like when Jesus returns, final judgment, the ultimate destination of Christians and non-Christians as well. So all those sorts of things are covered by eschatology.
So your PhD was on eschatology and Thessalonians, but more specific than that, where did you focus that research?
So one of the reasons I wanted to get into eschatology in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians was actually started back in my undergrad when I was in charge of leading a student Bible study. And for some reason that I still to this day can't remember, I decided 1st and 2nd Thessalonians would be a great thing to go through in a student Bible study. And I would be leading these. And so week on week prepared, 1st Thessalonians, not too bad. Get to 2nd Thessalonians, chapter 1, it's okay. Chapter 2 comes and everything fell apart. And I had no idea what I was doing. And so that was my sort of
Because for those who don't have instant recall, there's some tough stuff in chapter 2,
yeah,
right?
There's a lot of really mysterious figures and no one really knows what to do with it. And honestly, certainly when I was looking through it, there was not much lay level help for it. And I would say probably even today, there's not much either. So
okay, I actually had a crafty look in a couple of my Thessalonians commentaries this morning, and there's a section in chapter 2 of 2 Thessalonians where I was gratified to find, you probably know this, a footnote from Augustine in the City of God, where he goes, I have no idea what this is about.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't know, what hope the rest of us?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so you're in this student Bible study, and it's not going well in 2 Thessalonians 2.
Yeah. So I must have muddled my way through somehow and gotten something out of it. But when it came time to choose my topic for my PhD proposal, my PhD supervisor had done some helpful work with me on it. And part of choosing a good research topic is figuring out what you do and don't want to read. And I knew I wanted to do Paul, and I knew I didn't want to do Romans and Galatians. And 1st and 2nd Thessalonians sounded good. And I had, in that background, my experience with it, wanting to really get to grips with it and understand it. So it feels like quite a biographical thing for me to continue with. And I hope I understand it better now.
Great. Have you ever preached or taught through Thessalonians?
I have not preached or taught through Thessalonians. It does come up, though, doesn't it? It raises particular issues. And is it not the case that there's particular eschatological terms and concepts that only appear in the Thessalonian correspondence or primarily show up there?
A lot of the terms you'll find across the New Testament. So there's one term, the parousia, which is just a Greek name for Jesus coming back, is how it gets used. That shows up elsewhere in the New Testament. One figure in 2 Thessalonians 2 is called the restrainer, and that is a unique figure in the New Testament, and I think that's the one Augustine says, I must confess I have no idea who Paul is referring to. There is also the man of lawlessness, who usually people just equate with the Antichrist, but actually the term Antichrist doesn't appear in Thessalonians at all. That's from the Johannine epistles. So yeah, lots of stuff going on. I guess to answer your question, what I did more specifically in my PhD, there's a lot of debate within scholarship, but it seeps out into ministry as well, about if these two letters are consistent. Because in 1 Thessalonians, sort of the tone you get from what Paul has to say about when Jesus comes back is it's going to be sudden, it's going to be a surprise, no one's going to know. And you get to 2 Thessalonians, and Paul goes through these steps of things that happen before Jesus returns. And so the day of the Lord can't have happened because all these other things haven't happened either. And so it's how do you reconcile the two of those?
Okay, so that's a fairly basic issue. Is Scripture contradicting itself here?
Mm-hmm.
Help us into that. What's the way for someone to think that through?
I think if you come firstly with the theological conviction that Scripture isn't contradictory, that gives you some good guidelines for working out things that look contradictory. Actually, how do I bring those together? In scholarship, I couldn't quite approach it that way, but personally, theologically, that is something I wanted to work out for myself. What was really helpful and what came out in my work is that if you look across the New Testament, that same tension is found in other sections of the New Testament between the time of Jesus's return is unknown.
Yeah.
But here's signs ahead of it coming as well. And so I titled my thesis Suddenness and Signs, because that is a tension you'll find it in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and some in Luke 21. There's some of it in Revelation. So in all these other sections that have bits about eschatology, that seems to be a common theme. And so for me, that really helped to bring the two letters together. They're like two sides of something you see elsewhere in the New Testament.
Yeah. And is that tension between signs and suddenness, is that tension primarily coming out where 1 Thessalonians is kind of leaning one way and 2 Thessalonians leaning the other, or is it that also within 1 Thessalonians and within 2 Thessalonians you see kind of both themes emerging?
Yeah, they tend to lean one way or the other. So 1 Thessalonians does really, if you just take it on its own, it really does feel like it's going to be a really sudden thing. However, with the caveat that Paul doesn't actually say it's about to happen tomorrow or anything. He makes some statements about we who remain at his return, at his coming. So he, in himself, feels that because he's still alive, if Christ comes back while he's still alive, that's the camp he's going to be found in. But he doesn't specifically say at that point, it's going to be in 5 years and he's going to come back and this is exactly how it's going to be. 2 Thessalonians, there in the background, there's some sort of issue among the Thessalonians about thinking that the day of the Lord has come. There's some sort of confusion about that. And so for that reason, Paul is then at pains to show why that can't have happened. Whereas in 1 Thessalonians, the focus is really on the hope of that future coming that it brings. And so looking forward to that. And I think that's where a lot of the tension comes. It's just different pastoral aims of the two letters as well.
Okay. So getting a sense of the particular issue Paul is addressing. It's going to help us understand what his message is. I mean, could you spell out a bit more of that? So, in your understanding, what are the particularities of the pastoral issues he's addressing in each letter? And then help us a bit with what then he's trying to say about that.
In 1 Thessalonians in chapter 4, he talks about not grieving like those who have no hope. And goes on to talk about sort of what happens to fellow Christians who have died before Jesus returns. There's some debates about whether the Thessalonians actually knew about the resurrection of other believers, because we're not sure how long Paul was actually with the Thessalonians, kind of teaching them how much doctrine he could have covered in that time. The book of Acts mentions that he taught in the synagogues in Thessalonica for 3 consecutive Sabbaths. That doesn't mean he was only there for 3 weeks, but he does. It seems like everything we have, he faced some opposition there, had to leave really quite dramatically and quickly. And that leaves all sorts of questions for this really young, new community of Christians. Among which is some questions about what happens, when's Jesus coming back, what happens to people who die before he comes back. So there's some sort of question about the fate of those who have died. And so it's a letter seeking to provide comfort to grieving Christians, and which is usually, that tends to be the context chapter 4 gets preached in, is often either funerals, or you'll see it on headstones or things like that. It is an incredibly comforting passage. That's not the goal of 2 Thessalonians as much. There's some different stuff going on there.
Okay, so just help us a bit there. If that's the kind of situation Paul's speaking into, I mean, I'm picking up that you're saying we probably can't know with total certainty what the particular concern of the Christians is in 1 Thessalonians, but you sort of sketched out this general area.
Yeah, I think we can know enough to say it's something to do with what happens to Christians who have died, and how do we live our lives in light of that?
And so what is Paul basically wanting to say to them, eschatologically?
Yes, I think he says 2 things. I think he says, for those who have died, there is hope, because they're going to be resurrected on the day Jesus returns. And anyone who's still alive will be transformed in that day too, which goes with 1 Corinthians 15. So that's what he says in terms of comforting them. I think he also lays down a challenge at that point. In chapter 5, he talks about being on guard. So in light of the fact that Jesus is coming back, and it will be at a moment you don't know when he's coming back. Live life in light of that. Stay awake, be on guard. It's the same verb that gets used in the Garden of Gethsemane for when Jesus asks his disciples to keep watch. Keep watch for Jesus coming back.
Great. So that's 1 Thessalonians. Can you do the same thing for us with letter number 2? What do we know about what's going on among these folks, and how does that explain what Paul says that feels a bit different?
Absolutely,
to the first letter.
In 2 Thessalonians, there is a very strong presence of they're facing some sort of persecution. You get that in chapter 1. The language used there is of trials, tribulations. They're definitely being opposed. It seems there's hints of that in 1 Thessalonians. It seems to have gotten worse since then. So I think most people see that as fellow countrymen who aren't believers either verbally persecuting or keeping them out of public space. There's something going on there where they're feeling pressure and feeling, I think, probably lacking some confidence in their faith, because Paul then goes on to just affirm them of God's ultimate judgment, that it's guaranteed, and that there's this really great line where he does some wordplay where he's like, those who are afflicting you will be afflicted, and you who are afflicted will receive rest. So that's part of it, is whatever's happened, which probably was why Paul had to leave so suddenly in the first place. It's just gotten worse for the Christians in Thessalonica. At the same time, in chapter 2, Paul mentions some sort of rumor that has gone around, and he seems to not know where it's come from, whether it's been a letter or a prophecy or something's happened, where some people are thinking the day of the Lord has arrived. And it's hard to unpack that, because what does it mean for someone to actually think the day of the Lord has come? It's maybe helpful to talk about the day of the Lord as a term a little bit. That's taken from the Old Testament. The prophetic books talk about the day of the Lord as a moment of God's intervention, his rescue of his people, and a moment of judgment as well. It has two sides to it. Paul uses that term really commonly in his letters when he talks about Jesus coming back. It's the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord Jesus. So some rumors gone around that the day of the Lord has come. And it's hard for a lot of people to understand how people could have believed that. But there's been a lot of work done about...
Yeah, because...
Yeah.
That doesn't seem like a... Have you ever come across a whole bunch of Christians who just go around going, obviously the days of the Lord has already happened?
Well, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it, when you think about the history of the church, and you think about...
As you often do.
I often sit and think and ponder such things, and we should. And, eschatology, I mean, of course, has had this really potent hold on people, hasn't it? It always has been a subject of fascination and maybe sometimes speculation. I don't know, maybe that's partly what Paul is responding to, because we've seen whether it's groups in the 19th century or more recently, Harold Camping, if you're familiar with him in the United States, so he actually predicted.
It's ringing a slight bell. Help me out.
He had a following in the United States, predicted that the end of the earth was going to happen. Christ would return on a particular date, made these prophecies, these predictions, and then when it didn't happen, there were all sorts of creative ways in which it was revised after the fact to say, well, actually, it did happen, but it was, I'm not familiar with the details, but it would happen in a spiritual sense rather than a literal sense.
Right.
I think you always have these people who are fascinated with eschatology, and they find there's always ways to sort of retroactively say, well, actually, my prediction did come true. This did happen. It wasn't the way you expected it to happen. But it did. So, I mean, in some sense, it doesn't surprise me to think that in the first century, there would be people who could come up with the idea that actually the day of the Lord has taken place. And I think we still see examples of that. And so Paul is then writing into that. Before we do, in terms of dating for these epistles, what's the kind of consensus view on the gap between, and maybe that opens up, I mean, obviously, New Testament studies, there's lots of presuppositions in play about authorship and about what the New Testament documents represent. Does that impact the dating and the gap between these two? And I mean, there's a whole
and that confuses me, because there's a commentary that I when I preached through this is a long time ago now. Still got the commentary on my shelf. I can remember finding it helpful. Wanamaker in the New Testament Greek. I think he thinks 2 Thessalonians before 1 Thessalonians. Which gets slightly mind.
He reverses them.
He does.
Oh, in terms of, okay.
Yeah, 1 is 2 and 2 is 1. Remember that.
Yeah, I think he's one of the only ones who does that. But
okay, right.
He does. Yes, this plays into why I wanted to look at the letters. So from a purely scholarly side of things, there's a huge debate about authorship. Everyone agrees Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians. That is not up for debate. Every once in a while someone tries to say he didn't, but no one takes that. So that's consensus. And I think most people think it's his first letter and possibly the first book of the New Testament in terms of when it was written. So I think most people date it somewhere 49 to 50 AD while he's in Corinth on his first visit to Corinth. So he's in Corinth for 18 months after his sort of hectic journey through Thessalonica and Athens, and then stays in Corinth. So most people think that's when he wrote 1 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians is possibly the most debated in terms of authorship among Pauline scholars, in the sense that there is no clear consensus, and it's pretty much half and half think Paul wrote it and half think he didn't. A lot of it's tied to eschatology. So a lot of it's tied into this idea that the two letters are contradictory.
Right. The same person couldn't have consistently believed both things.
Yeah. There's some other issues. There's some really close literary parallels between the two where there's literally identical phrasing, and people think, oh, it's someone just copying what Paul said to make it look authentic. Some people say 2 Thessalonians has a
Which I've always felt like that. Whenever I come across that feels like the most desperate argument for people who want to hold on to Paul didn't write this. Yeah, my argument for why Paul didn't write is it sounds really like Paul. It seems like a really bad argument.
Yeah. There's other people say it has a different tone. So 2 Thessalonians is harsher and more authoritarian. So those are the general arguments about it. And so I didn't want to get fully into that in my thesis, but I did want to tackle the eschatology side of things and be kind of say, are these contradictory?
Okay.
Here's ways to bring them together. So because of that, authorship, people, if Paul didn't write it, it's quite late in the 1st century. However, for scholars like me who think Paul did write it, most of us would say very quickly after 1 Thessalonians. So within the same, some have said within weeks. Some say maybe a few months down the line as news comes back to him because he sends Timothy off to visit them. And Timothy comes back and says, well, things are really bad. You need to write another letter to deal with this. So those who do think Paul wrote it, most of us would say within the same time frame. So they're possibly the two earliest letters we have. If they were written so close together, I think that can explain the similar phrasing too. Where he's got the same phrases in his mind. The tone can very easily be explained by a big crisis coming up. I certainly change my tone when I need to quickly deal with something. So yeah, that's in terms of authorship. That's the main debates, and I think most commentaries actually think both were written by Paul. You'll find a few that don't agree, but for the most part, commentaries tend to have that.
Yep.
It's when you get into other scholarship that you find the debates happening.
Okay, so even among unbelieving scholars, there's a consensus problem. Paul wrote both. Okay, so this is really helpful. We were into the 1 Thessalonians. Paul has a strong sense on Christ is coming. It'll be unexpected, and you're saying that's explicable by the particular pastoral issue he's addressing. Mm-hmm. That there's just grief and concern over Christians who've died, and Christ hasn't come back yet, and what'll happen to them. And is it that he's wanting in 1 Thessalonians? Is it that he's wanting to give them a sense of there's a certainty that he's coming back? He just is. It's going to be unexpected, but it is certain. Is that where he's kind of erring pastorally? I
think so. Yeah, I think he's really wanting to give them that certainty and hope in the midst of grief for Christ is coming back, and those who have died aren't going to miss out on that. Okay, great. Now we got into the Day of the Lord and stuff really helpfully because we were doing the same kind of thinking, but now in relation to 2 Thessalonians, and you're saying Paul sounds different on eschatology because it's a different situation. Mm-hmm. And I was finding that really interesting because I was kind of expecting someone. This is a compliment, not a criticism. I was kind of expecting that someone who'd done a PhD on it would finally explain to me who the restrainer is and what exactly their misunderstanding of the Day of the Lord was, so I could now preach this with great confidence. And you're kind of saying we sort of know the general territory, but we don't know. So take us back to what they be misunderstanding about the Day of the Lord in the 2 Thessalonian situation. Yeah. So this is, I'm not sure everyone's going to agree with me on this. So this is my own personal thoughts on it. I think they took from 1 Thessalonians that there was a difference between the parousia, so Jesus is coming, and the Day of the Lord. And so they saw the parousia as Jesus coming to save them.
So parousia is this Greek word translated coming, return of Christ, that kind of thing. Appearing.
That's it. And so they see this term and they think that's when Jesus comes and saves us. And Day of the Lord, because of the way it's talked about in 1 Thessalonians 5, is very centered on judgment. That's the whole passage is basically about on the day of the Lord, believers will not escape.
Okay.
And so a moment of judgment. And so the reason I think that is because that is one way to take the day of the Lord from some of the prophets. It is, in some of the prophets, it is solely about destruction. And so you could see how the Thessalonians could potentially misconstrue that, or if someone decided they'd had a prophecy explaining 1 Thessalonians to mean that. Because I think what he then does in 2 Thessalonians is links the two completely together.
Right, so these Thessalonians in 2 Thessalonians, is this right? They're thinking something like, well, parousia hasn't happened because we have not seen Christ return. Parousia clearly not happened.
Yes.
But is there something they're seeing that to them looks like an act of judgment from God?
So that's what I think.
That has happened.
Yeah, that's what I think. And that's what a few very influential scholars think. So they started me off on that path.
Okay,
and
including influential scholars here present.
A few articles point to some things that were happening in that region of the world, kind of in the 48 to 50 time frame. Some ancient historians talk about that as particularly tragic years, lots of earthquakes and famine and a lot going on. There's different events that could have happened that could have made someone think this is the day of the Lord. I think one reason people who don't think Paul wrote it think it's quite late is they associate the destruction of the temple with that's the only thing that could have been dramatic enough to be the end of the world.
Yeah.
However, if you think to a very pressurized situation, with people thinking about we're hoping in the day of the Lord, and we're hoping in the parousia, and we're looking out for signs of it. It is possible that something that we maybe, thousands of years down the line think compared to everything else going on isn't that big a deal. It could have felt very, I'm going to use the phrase apocalyptic, dramatic. It could have felt like that very easily to someone. And I'm not saying all the Thessalonians believed this, but it could have been a big enough faction.
And that happens all the time, doesn't it? Stuff happens to people. This is the end of the world.
Well, and I'm wondering too about the time and the distance and the location. So if people point, the destruction of the temple. Obviously, that's a huge event that is much discussed. But if I'm over in that part of the world in Thessalonica, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, I don't know. Maybe it's not the case, but it's not obvious to me that that's going to be at the top of my radar in the first century context, and maybe some more local event would mean much more to me and to my family than this event happening elsewhere.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that? But you're saying there are people who do want to link it in some way.
Yeah, some people want to link it
to the
destruction of the temple. I think because there's temple language happening in chapter 2, talks about the man of lawlessness sitting in the temple. And so they associate that with Vespasian, who goes in to destroys the temple. And so they see that as that.
Okay, but you don't think you need to go there?
I don't think you need to go there.
Could be just local stuff in Greece.
Yeah.
That's really helpfully clear on the kind of situation Paul might be addressing. Just help us with, how does that explain why he now, in terms of the solution he presents, how does that explain how he sounds different from how he does? In 1 Thessalonians, he emphasizes certainty and suddenness. 2 Thessalonians, he starts talking about signs that you'll see beforehand. Why does he give that different response to this different problem in the 2 Thessalonians situation?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with restraint, to use the vocabulary of it, is giving some clear guidelines around these things have not happened. And at one point, I think it's 2 verse 5, he says, as I told you when I was with you. I mean, that's why some of it's just lost to us about what actually he said to them and what happened. I can make my confident assertions, but we don't ultimately know what previous knowledge he's drawing on. And so some of it is just, he's going back to, I'm sure he would have told them some about the end time scenario. So some of these figures they just would have known who he was talking about. But he points back to them to be like, remember I told you these things. And so this rumor you're hearing doesn't line up with what I told you.
Right. Okay.
So think back to what I told you and hold on to that. Don't get like off course from.
Okay. I don't know about you, Matt. This is really helpful. The kind of feel I'm getting is, help me if this is along the right kind of lines. Sounding like in 1 Thessalonians, it's a fairly basic issue they've got. People are dying. Is Jesus going to come back and make it all okay for them? Or are they lost now? How do we know? In that sense, it's kind of really basic. In 2 Thessalonians, they've gone beyond eschatology 101. They're doing kind of hyper eschatology. They're making distinctions. Well, there's a parousia, the appearing, and we don't think that has happened. But there's this thing, the day of the Lord. They're kind of dividing eschatology a bit more, thinking harder about it. And in order to deal with that kind of more detailed misunderstanding, Paul there just brings in a lot more detail about events you might want to look out for that just weren't needed. He didn't have to talk about that to sort them out in the 1 Thessalonian situation. As I say, that's sounding quite. Is that too simplistic or something like that?
No, I think that's a good summary. I think I would just want to add to that, which I don't think I said, is I still think there is a comfort aspect to 2 Thessalonians. I think he's writing to the majority who don't necessarily think the day of the Lord has happened, but have a lot of questions about it because there's this group saying the day of the Lord has happened. And so part of it is like refuting that claim. But I think in chapter 1, he spends a while just reassuring them that they will be saved, they will be with Jesus, they will. And so I think compared to 1 Thessalonians, it's more about they will be, your relatives, your friends who have died, they will be with you when Jesus comes. They are not lost. I think 2 Thessalonians is more about the day of the Lord hasn't happened and Jesus' return hasn't passed you by. It's not failed to show up.
Okay. Right.
And they think it has passed them by because potentially some local event that was of great significance has got some of them saying, "Hey, maybe
like
this
judgment's
was
come,
it.
but salvation hasn't." I think that's
okay. Right.
And presumably, then Paul, through his messengers, he knows about this rumor. He knows what they're thinking. He knows if there is a local event that's prompted this. He knows what it is, and he knows some of the detail. And now he's going to speak into it. Do you think that? But we don't know what he knows. Do you think that gap between what he knows about their context and we don't know, just reading the letter, do you think that helps explain some of why some of those passages in 2 Thessalonians especially have proven so difficult and feel so obscure because we're only hearing kind of one side of the conversation, as it were?
Yeah, definitely. I am not surprised people struggle with 2 Thessalonians in particular. I think it's a harder one to get from the historical into the theological takeaways. What does it mean for us today? I do think that's a harder jump for a lot of people, because it feels obscure. A lot of us aren't comfortable with reading apocalyptic literature. I don't know if this is the case across the board, but certainly the joke is about the book of Revelation that people only ever preach on the letters to the churches and nothing else in the book, or they only spend time on all the symbols and stuff. And so I think just generally we have a harder time with apocalyptic literature because we're not used to being taught how to read it. And so I think that's part of the problem.
Mm-hmm. A minute or two ago, I just held you back from telling us more about the man of lawlessness. So in the second letter, man of lawlessness and the restrainer. Help us out.
Yeah. These are my best guesses because I think this is where the evidence points, but I'm not positive. So I think the restrainer, for me, I found a little easier. I think Paul is drawing on.
Shall I read the verse, or do you know it off by heart?
Well, maybe.
You probably do. Just being polite. So we're in, probably because we're in some detail here. We're in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2.
And now you know what is holding him back. Let's talk about the man of lawlessness. What's holding him back so that he may be revealed at the proper time? For the secret power of lawlessness is already at work. But the one who now holds it back will continue to do so till he's taken out of the way. That bit, what holds him back, or the one who holds him back, is the restrainer, is how you translate the Greek verb there. So the one who restrains and the restraining force are how to think of those.
Yep.
So there's a lot of questions about what's happening there, who's holding back the man of lawlessness, who seems to be, I think the way we think about an antichrist figure is probably accurate for that, even without using the terminology. Right. I think he's based on sorry, I'm jumping back to the man of lawlessness. I think the man of lawlessness is based on a lot of Jewish history. So it's based in Daniel, the abomination of desolation sort of language, and this king who sets himself up against God and everyone.
So back to, what's his name? Antiochus Epiphanes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, Antiochus Epiphanes, who in kind of the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament comes in and conquers Jerusalem. He's a Syrian ruler, comes in, takes over Jerusalem, and desecrates the temple. So Daniel points forward to that. We have some writings called the Maccabees that also talk about what happens there. Okay. And so he's the sort of like is archetype the right word? That he's the original figure who demonstrates this just absolute prideful setting himself up against God. Then you have a Roman general called Pompey who comes in and similarly desecrates the temple in Jerusalem. He is often referred to as the lawless one in some of the Jewish writings.
Is he the pig sacrificing guy? Have I got? Someone I was reading went in and providing sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple.
Yeah, I should know that. But
I don't know who it is. But so it's this kind of character that people, these people have done.
Mm-hmm. So again, this political ruler who comes in and just really desecrates the holy place. So he'll get referred to with similar language from Daniel sometimes as well.
That's interesting.
Then you move down the timeline, and one of the Roman emperors, Caligula, has this plan in the 40s.
He's not known as a nice guy, is he, Caligula? No. I'm remembering that.
Not a nice guy. And he has this plan in right around 39 to 40 AD to send a statue to Jerusalem that gets set up in the holy place, in the temple in Jerusalem. And there is great outrage over this among the Jewish
statue population. Of himself. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Of himself, I think in the style of portraying himself as Zeus. So portraying himself as God, set up in the temple, sounding a little familiar to 2 Thessalonians here.
Okay.
But I think what you have there is just this train of these rulers who set themselves up against God and desecrate what is holy.
Right.
So I think Paul's drawing on that language to point towards a sort of eschatological end-time opponent of some sort. And that's about as much as I think you can get there. But he's saying to the Thessalonians, that figure hasn't shown up and arrived.
Right.
I told you about that figure. He's not shown up. So that's the first thing. The man of lawlessness hasn't been revealed, is the language Paul uses. He'll say the mystery of lawlessness is still at work. So lawlessness happens, and it's seen in this whole pattern across the centuries of people doing evil things.
Yep.
But the sort of central figure of lawlessness that's empowered by Satan himself hasn't appeared yet.
Okay.
So that's why it gets read as Antichrist in the following centuries.
Right. So, okay. So if I'm putting the pieces together, so even though these awful disasters have happened around you, which make you think the day of the Lord has happened, and are worried that salvation, the appearing, has passed you by. No, salvation has not passed you by, because final salvation will only come after this final man of lawlessness figure has come and
been revealed, been like made obvious,
done his worst, and everybody knows what's happening.
Yeah.
That's kind of the argument, is it? That's what Paul's wanting to say.
Yeah, and I think this is where it gets hard for interpreting. Is I mean, honestly, I haven't quite worked out how best to talk about the man of lawlessness figure. I'm working on wrapping my head around how we think about and talk about that today. But I think what I am confident about is that's the pattern Paul's pointing to, is prideful evil turned against God.
Okay.
And he uses that he uses that to say that will be defeated. The moment Jesus appears is the moment the man of lawlessness is killed. And so again, you get that hope coming in.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was talking about the restrainer and went on to the man of lawlessness.
No, that's all good.
But Paul also says the reason he's not appeared, this man of lawlessness, or he's not been revealed, is because he's being restrained by something. And that's, I think one commentary says there's like 10 different interpretations of who the restrainer is. It was very popular. Some of the early church fathers thought it was the Roman Empire. So the rule of the land, law and order, kept evil in check until this final moment. So you do get a lot of that. More common today.
You've got to feel quite positively about the Roman Empire.
Yes. That's part of the problem.
You're overlooking quite... Okay.
Yeah. More common today is to actually see it as a supernatural, angelic figure. And that's rooted, if we go back to Daniel, it's rooted in some of what happens in Daniel in the same sections, is you have different angels who are over different earthly empires. And the archangel Michael is over the nation of Israel. He's with the people of God. And in chapter 12, it says, when Michael arises, lawlessness such as has never been seen before and never will be seen again comes. But kind of at that moment, God's people will be saved and his enemies will be destroyed. And then you get a promise of resurrection at that point too. And that all feels very similar to what's happening across the Thessalonian letters. And so a lot of people will then say, actually, I think the restraining figure is probably Michael. And he is he's God's agent to hold back the full expression of lawlessness until God's appointed moment. So God's in charge of it all. But he's at some point, Michael's going to he's going to remove himself, or God's going to remove him from the scene, and the final drama is all going to play out.
That's a fascinating spiritual perspective on the world now, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And just Sydney, you mentioned kind of history of interpretation of this. This has obviously generated all sorts of speculative, exegetical solutions to this problem. I just wondering, as you think about that and you think about what New Testament scholars are doing today, to what extent do you think, I mean, is this one of these things where can 2 Thessalonians 2 sort of solve the problem, or a lot of these differing exegetical interpretations, are they coming out of other presuppositions people bring to the text, larger kind of hermeneutical ways of thinking about eschatology and how the Bible fits together? In other words, do you think if we're going to understand this, can we just sort of exegete the text on its own, and this is what Paul means, or is it really a matter of larger questions about how we put our Bibles together and how we understand these bigger pieces of theology and eschatology?
It's a complex question, Matt. I think a lot of my experience is working with just pure people historically wanting to understand, what did Paul mean? Exactly what did he mean? And not then taking that next step to how do we move from that into preaching or teaching or exhortation. And I think that's kind of, I'm finding myself in a place of trying to make that next step off of, I've done the historical work and then relating it to theology. I think that's one of the things I really enjoyed at Oak Hill, is bringing the two together and being able to start thinking about, I think good historical work's incredibly important. And I think it's vital to be working at what influences could be behind this. How does that open up the text? What might have been happening? But I don't think that's the end of the story for us either. And I think it's taking that step from here's exactly what Paul wrote into here's how it impacts us as Christians 2,000 years down the line. I feel like I didn't answer that very fully.
Well, and one of the things it raises to me is just having this conversation, hearing you unpack different pieces of it. Here, you referenced the Augustine quote about some of these questions. You recognize
the one about I have no idea what this
I
means.
don't. Yeah,
yeah. That one.
You're confronted with this, and I'm just thinking, if we're thinking about moving from kind of historical questions, okay, what did Paul mean in when he wrote this, and now if we're thinking about preaching and we're thinking about teaching in the local church, it does raise the question, doesn't it? If I'm trying to proclaim God's word to God's people, and I come to the text, and I'm genuinely, despite my best prayerful efforts, I'm genuinely puzzled as to what this means. Yeah. What do I do with that, and how do I take that as a faithful herald when I'm not sure what I'm meant to be heralding?
Because you could feel really unnerved by some things you're saying. I was planning to do a talk series for the church youth group through 1 and 2 Thessalonians, and I just assume that after my study I'm going to have a good idea of who the man of lawlessness is, of who the restrainer is, of just precisely what the misunderstanding that Paul was addressing in each case was. And I thought I'd be able to get answer those questions in a few hours study and some good uses and good commentaries. And here is someone who spent years on a PhD on it going, that could sound unnerving, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And when it's Thursday and Sunday's coming, this is a real existential moment. You preached through 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, you say?
A long time ago. So don't ask me to recall it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think this is where I accept my limitations as a human, and I think it's a really helpful exercise in remembering that God is bigger than us and his word is bigger than us.
Yep.
And if that's enough to take away from this, I think that's a good start. I think you can take some theological principles out of 2 Thessalonians, and I think when I seek to teach it, some key things I like to focus on is just the message of peace across all 3 chapters of it. Is there's a constant resting in the fact that God will make all things right in the end. Whether you're facing persecution, whether you're dealing with rumors of war and other things, or whether you're dealing with, in chapter 3, church members who maybe aren't fully pulling their weight, and there's various things, but at every one of those chapters, it ends on a note of confidence in who God is, and that he will make all things right, that evil will fully be defeated in the end. And so those for me are the heartwarming, refreshing takeaways, and I will be speaking on 2 Thessalonians very soon, and when I come to do that, that's what I'm focusing on: God's victory over evil, God's peace now, and ultimately those are the takeaways whether you know exactly who these figures are, I ultimately do not think that matters. I think it's fun to think about if you have time, but it's not something I would ever want someone to feel stressed or worried about.
That's huge. That I find that hugely helpful. That resonates with something. Actually, Augustine says in On Christian Teaching, addressing the question, why are there apparently obscure parts of the Bible? And he may well have had this one in as an example in mind. And one of his answers is, it's to humble us. That these are the things of God that are being spoken of here, and we will never fully understand. What I like very much about just thinking of preaching and Bible studies in mind, what I like about very much about what you just said is, you may not understand every detail, but nevertheless, there is a very clear message here about a very particular set of issues in our lives that we can address and can speak into from this. I find that really helpful. Can I ask this? Having spent all this time in 1 and 2 Thessalonians, and you began by saying, look, some people allege there's just a straight contradiction between them. One is, makes no mention of signs before the end, suddenly Jesus comes. The other is, here are the signs to watch for, so you'll know he's coming. And I very helpfully said, well, if someone thinks that's a problem here, actually they've got a much bigger problem, because that's an issue right across the New Testament. As you put all that together, as you, as a believer yourself, look into the future, where do you want sort of the centre of gravity to be for you? Is it, I'm not reading the Times, I'm not looking for signs, he'll come any moment? Or is there a sense of, no, I know it can't be yet because such and such hasn't happened? How do you locate yourself just as a believer yourself in that?
Yeah, I guess for me personally, I almost want to say both. Like there's a really good, helpful reminder that the Lord is coming back, and that impacts every single decision I make every single day. And I'm to keep watch and behave in line with my faith, and that's a really helpful grounding thing that I do think about a lot. I think, having studied this a lot, I'm quite happy to leave it to God's timing. I think the danger is becoming almost complacent and, well, he's not come for 2,000 years, so probably not going to happen anytime soon. So I think for me it's probably a better reminder of he is coming, and that makes a difference every day.
Great, thank you very much. Any more questions?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's that tension between he's coming soon. It could come at any moment, but there's there's that tension. And the other tension that this conversation raises for me is again, it's so we have these passages, we have these references. There's some difficult things in here. Greater interpreters than any of us have found them difficult. Peter says that some of the things Paul writes are hard to understand, right? We've got that on the one hand. And I think it's interesting because you find yourself sometimes in talking to people in church stuck a little bit between wanting to emphasize that and say, hey, you know what, this is hard. We probably won't understand it. There's more here. This is deeper than we're ever going to go in this life. On the other hand, you find yourself wanting to encourage people but we should be thinking deeply about God and the things of God. And these verses about the lawless one being revealed are every bit as inspired as passages with which we're more familiar. And people like yourself are spending lots of time and energy trying to think about this and think deeply about this. And so finding that tension between, on the one hand, saying, hey, there's a sense in which you don't need to be losing sleep if you can't put all the dots together perfectly. On the other hand, not wanting to suggest to people, hey, you don't need to worry about this. It's crazy. Don't pay it any mind.
Nobody knows.
And living in and striking that balance, I think, is tricky, but
there's that famous quote, and I can't remember who it's from, and I think it was talking about John's Gospel, but I think it applies as much today. Of God's word is shallow enough for a duck to paddle in, but deep enough or shallow enough for a duck to walk in, but deep enough for an elephant to wade in, and that you can always get more out of it, but it also, whatever level you're at.
That's a helpful quote. Is it Gregory the first one on that? Gregory Great? Is he the first one on that?
I've
Elephant
heard
swimming,
that.
lamb paddling. Is that
I've heard
See, I've
that
mixed up all
attributed
the
to different
animals.
people. I've heard it with different animals. Sometimes it's a
there you go.
The sentiment's there.
It's a mix and match quote. You can do what you get: big animal, little animal. Excellent. Final thing for folks in ministry: top commentary tips on Thessalonian letters. This is a popular level. I'm going to throw in John Stott's BFT. I think that's.
I haven't spent much time with that one, so I'm not sure.
He obviously the stuff he doesn't get into, but he just packs so much into that. That's hugely helpful. It's a great one, I think.
Yeah, Nijay Gupta has a recent one in the...
Who was that?
Nijay Gupta.
Okay.
In the... I think it's called the New Covenant Commentary series, which is at a lay level, but he's incredibly well versed in Thessalonians. If someone's wanting a more complex but still overview, Nijay Gupta also has what's called a critical introduction to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians by Zondervan, and that is just an amazing resource that I've recommended to everyone who wants to get a view of what's been said on all these things.
Do you need Greek to understand that?
There are sections of Greek, but most of it you don't need Greek.
Great.
So that's sort of a next step up from...
Brilliant. Thanks, Sydney. That was really fascinating. Just hugely helpful on some real historical details, but showing how we need to think about those and how building on that we get to some real sort of pastoral, practical conclusions too, and helping us steer through what we know and what we don't know. We trust that this Deep Roots podcast has been a blessing to you, and we'll be back in a month's time. See you then.